In this video, we're going to be talking about the Opportunist period, which was the brief period of time between the 1960s and the 1980s when U.S. language policies became much more pluralist and began to really work towards meeting the needs of multilingual learners and immigrant students. And again, before we get into this period, I want to talk a little bit about what had shifted in terms of demographics as well. So we talked about how, prior to the 1900s and moving into the 1900s, there was a massive influx of immigrants, and that created a lot of fear and a lot of concern that immigrants were taking over the United States. As a result of many repressive policies that we discussed in the previous video, the number of immigrants did decline, and their percentage, their share of the total U.S. population certainly declined greatly. So as you can see down at the 1960s through the 80s, rather than being 15% of the population, they were closer to 5 to 7% of the population. So with this reduced risk that some felt that immigrants were kind of going to take over the United States, came much more permissive or any opportunist policies for immigrant children and multilingual learners. Of course, also at this time period, there were other events that were contributing to shifts in mindsets around bilingual education and language rights. One was the Civil Rights Movement, which, along with pushing for equality in terms of racial justice, language, and the right to be able to understand schooling and be educated and maintain your home language, became connected to civil rights, the civil rights era, as an issue of social justice. But also at that time period, we had the Cold War, we had the space race with Russia. This is a picture of Sputnik. So there were kind of factors outside of the United States that were also influencing how the United States was starting to think about our positionality in relation to the rest of the world, and how we needed to, the type of competitiveness that we needed to develop, which in part involved language. So some of the legislation that was developed during this era that's important to know, legislation and court cases. First was Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which instituted segregated schooling and said that segregated schools are unconstitutional. Students shouldn't be put into separate schools based on their race or any other factor. Connected back to the Cold War and the space race was the National Defense Act of 1958. So this act provided, among other things, it provided federal funding to help bolster foreign language education. World language education began to be seen as an asset to help us compete on a global stage. Again, this was not simply done as a way to make sure everybody had access to speaking other languages. It really was geared towards native English speakers learning world languages or foreign languages, but still was a step toward demonstrating that we were moving away from the English-only Americanization movement of the previous era. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin, and it has been used by advocates for language rights as a way of saying that language is a piece of this discrimination that should be prohibited. And not long thereafter, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act was the first piece of legislation that really addressed the federal government's role in shaping schooling. And this foundational piece of legislation instituted Title I, which allocates federal funds to support low-income students, Head Start programs, and also Title VII, which was called the Bilingual Education Act, and was part of the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act. And this was the first federal policy that addressed the needs of English learners. It identified bilingual education as one way to address English learners' needs, although of course it left kind of it open to any way that they could be served effectively. So it didn't mandate bilingual education, but it did provide some funding to support bilingual programs. Oh, there we go. Not too long after this, we have our first court case pushing back against how schools have not quite changed, even though policies have. Lau versus Nichols, which was a case that was brought by Chinese parents living in San Francisco, who argued that their children were still being put into English-only classrooms and they didn't understand anything that they were learning. This court case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they ended up ruling with the plaintiffs and saying, you're right, equal access to education involves language as well. These students have the right to an ESL or a bilingual program. And this was a quote that is from the Lau versus Nichols case that I think kind of embodies what it was all about. They said there was no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum for students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. So really making a strong case for bilingual education, but also ensuring that teachers are providing students with access to education. That's a really important one to know. Shortly after Lau versus Nichols, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act was passed, which said that education agencies, so states and districts, must take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by its students in instructional programs. So again, saying schools have an obligation to overcome language barriers. They can't just, have students sitting in the corner of the classroom doing a coloring book while the rest of the students are learning. That schools have to take the appropriate action to overcome those barriers or to provide participation. Lau remedies came shortly thereafter because Lau versus Nichols didn't actually stipulate anything. It just said schools had to provide access, as did the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. So Lau remedies tried to offer some guidelines for how some of these educational inequities for minority students might be addressed, but it was never actually mandated. So while they had some stipulations put in place, the remedies didn't do much because districts didn't have any obligation to follow them. So then again, another court case came along, Castaneda versus Picard, this time in Texas in 1981, arguing that schools were not serving language minoritized students effectively. And so from that court case came this three-step test that districts had to follow in order to be legally serving language minority students in the way that they need to be. And so the three-step test that was developed was asking, is the program that you're implementing theoretically sound? Is it grounded in research, evidence that it's successful? 2, have you sufficiently provided the resources and personnel needed to make sure it can be effective? And then 3, is the program actually effective? So monitoring and evaluating the program. So again, this doesn't provide like a specific program model as the guideline, but it does provide at least some framework that districts have to follow as they think about how to best support multilingual learners. All right. Yeah, sorry about that. And the last, so Castaneda versus Picard is also a very important court case to know. Another one that's important is Plyler versus Doe, which was another court case in Texas that began in Texas and was seen by the Supreme Court in 1982. And this was the case that determined that undocumented students must have access to free public education. It was brought about because there were undocumented students who were being told that they had to pay if they wanted to come into the public school system, that the public school was not going to just welcome them in and serve them as students. And this court case said that was denying children opportunities for the future by not allowing them to come into the public education system. And again, this wasn't that long ago. This is 1982, so about 50 years ago. All right, so there you see some of the moves that were made to try to make sure that we were supporting minoritized language speakers, multilingual learners. Another positive during this time period was that we saw the first two-way bilingual program. So the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, and as a result, many Cubans fled Cuba and came to Florida with the intention that they would go back to Cuba when they could. And so they started to establish bilingual schools, such as Coral Way Elementary, which is viewed as the first two-way bilingual program in the US. Two-way meaning that it served both native English speakers and native Spanish speakers, learning together in English and in Spanish throughout the whole day. And the goal behind it was that, then the Cuban children would learn English and Spanish. So when they went back to Cuba, they would be able to thrive in Cuban schools, but they could also be successful in US schools while they were here. And it was a very successful program. It's still in existence today, and is often cited as kind of the beginning of two-way bilingual programs in the US. But it's important to point out that while this was maybe the first two-way bilingual program, most bilingual programs at this time were still assimilationist. They were still transitional, which you might remember means that the goal was to just have students learn in their home language for a couple of years, 1 to 3 years, and then move them into an English-only classroom. The goal wasn't for them to maintain their home language and develop it academically for the entirety of their schooling. So we've highlighted a lot of things that were really positive in terms of moves for language minority speakers and multilingual learners and immigrant children. But on the other side, the assimilationist side, Native Americans during this era experienced ongoing prejudice and discrimination. This is an era when a lot of reservations began to be dismantled, and there was urban migration. So Native Americans kind of moving into urban centers, but a lot of being forced relocation that again was kind of contributing to the erasure of many indigenous languages as it became harder to maintain their home languages. All right, so there's some positive and also not so positive aspects of this era. Really important court cases and policies for you to know, because a lot of them do still impact language education today. So jot down a few notes about anything that surprised you, anything you want to remember, anything that you think still influences language and education today. And as I just said, that some of these definitely do, and any questions you still have. And I'll see you in the next video.